You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Welcome to Unbiased Science,
where we bring scientific method to the madness.
We're your hosts, Dr. Jess Steier
and Dr. Sarah Scheinman.
And today's topic is, is a little saucy. It's kind of fun.
It's very fun. I had such a blast researching this topic. Like, I'm not gonna lie.
Of course you did. Well, and you came up with the topic. Do you want to announce what the topic is?
Sure. Guys, today we're going to be talking about psilocybin, and also known as magic mushrooms. Shrooms. Yeah, I actually did. I was like, how many different slang words are there for psilocybin? And so I sort of went down a bit of a terminology rabbit hole, and some of what I came up with was shrooms, magic mushrooms, caps, mushies, silos, fungi, liberty caps, purple passion, and little teachers.
Little teachers.
Among others. So anyway, whatever you know it by, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I think just for the purposes of the fact that we are a science podcast, like for the rest of the episode, we're going to be referring to it by the scientific name of psilocybin.
Oh, that was Sarah's way of very gently getting me in line here. I will not say shrooms, I promise. Psilocybin is how we will refer to it from here on out. I'm going to give a little disclaimer to our audience that we are recording this during February break. And my hubby is working right now, so my kids are upstairs. And I told them not to come get me unless there's blood, and I will only go upstairs if I smell fire or smoke. So that is where we're at. So if there are any interruptions, I apologize. Okay. All right. So I don't know, where do we, I can sort of jump in with the, stats on usage, but I don't know do you want to start there? Did you want to jump in with any sort of definition or setting the stage? What makes the most sense?
I mean, I'll do a very, very quick definition. So psilocybin, known by many other names, is a psychedelic, or it's a hallucinogenic drug, and it belongs to, very broadly, a class of compounds that are called tryptamines. And it's also, like, when we're talking about different drugs, oftentimes drugs are classified into various categorizations. So we have our central nervous system depressants, central nervous system stimulants, and then one of the classifications is hallucinogens. So there are other drugs that belong to this class, but today we're really going to be focusing in on psilocybin because this particular drug has been making the news recently because there is a lot of interest in particularly psilocybin when it comes to the treatment of various mental illnesses. So we're going to definitely get into that as well, but that's why we chose this topic.
Yeah, it was actually on the ballot here, in our local, it was one of the local.
Was it really?
Yeah. I don't know if it's done at the county level or how that works, but it was on the ballot. It did not pass, but interesting. I know that this is something, as you just mentioned, that a lot of municipalities are considering, states are considering. We're going to get into that, into some of the, legality and policies and all that good stuff in just a little bit. So I was able to pull some stats on usage. So there was this report put out by RAND in 2024 that found that approximately 12% of American adults have used psilocybin at some point in their lives, with 3.1% reporting use within the past year. This translates to an estimated 8 million American adults using psilocybin in 2023. Interestingly, psilocybin mushrooms have emerged as the most commonly used psychedelic substance in the country. And among people who reported psilocybin use in the past year, nearly half indicated that their most recent experience involved microdosing. I see this word everywhere. This is a social media buzzword right now. So they consumed subperceptual doses intended to, quote, enhance well-being or cognitive function without inducing full psychedelic effects. And I will be picking your neuroscientist brain about that.
Absolutely. I have a lot of thoughts on microdosing.
Ooh,
And stuff.
okay. Oh, my interest is really piqued here. All right. The other thing I did, it was so interesting to read about the history of how this came to be.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because humans have been experimenting with hallucinogenic substances and psychoactive substances for many, many thousands of years even.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just because they're so these mushrooms they're found just naturally in nature too. So it may be that people have sort of stumbled about it accidentally in different points in history.
Mm-hmm. And it's also used in some rituals for certain cultures around the globe. So anyway, let me get into
Take us back, Jess. Let's hear a history. Let's have a history.
history time with Jess. So humans have been consuming hallucinogenic mushrooms in ritual and spiritual contexts for thousands of years. So the discovery of psilocybin traces back to 1529 when Spanish friar, and you know I'm very self-conscious about my pronunciation, so I apologize, Bernardino de Saguan documented the Aztecs' use of sacred mushrooms. Oh God, I'm going to butcher this. Tianana cattle, God's flesh. So it translates to God's flesh, and this was in Mexico. So while initially controversial, the existence of these mushrooms was confirmed in the late 1930s when Harvard botanist Richard Evans Schultz identified 3 sacred mushroom species in Mexico. Now, a major breakthrough came in the 1950s when R. Gordon Wasson and his wife investigated these mushrooms, leading to a pivotal 1955 experience with Mazatec Curanadera Maria Sabina. Now, there's a really incredible Life magazine article from 1957, which we are going to link in our show notes, and it introduced psychoactive mushrooms to mainstream awareness. I feel like that's kind of a big deal. 1957, like this, it became, was brought to the mainstream.
And I mean, that in particular sort of brings to mind like the beginning of like the 60s, which like Summer of Love, like the psychedelics really had a heyday during the decade of the 60s, I think, 1960s.
Oh, yes. I'm like picturing Hair, Age of Aquarius is playing in the background. All right. So French mycologist Roger Haim then identified several mushrooms as psilocybin, I'm probably butchering that species, and successfully cultivated them. I swear I'm almost done. The final crucial step came when Albert Hofmann, known for discovering LSD, isolated and characterized psilocybin at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. He identified both psilocybin, which is a stable, water-soluble crystalline compound, and its dephosphorylated form, psilocin, which is less stable and not water-soluble. And this chemical characterization completed the scientific understanding of the compound's properties and structure. Interesting?
I feel like that only scratches the surface a little bit of like how long, like where it came from, and like I said earlier, like I'm fairly certain like different cultures throughout like across the globe have found these different species of mushrooms. And psilocybin, by the way, is not only found in one species of mushroom. I think you sort of alluded to this too. It's it's found in various multiple different species,
right? Multiple species. And just real quick to clarify, so yes, I mean, I said that the discovery traces back to the 1500s, right? I mean, that's the first documented time. I mean, who knows when it was actually discovered? And then I really fast forward to the early 1900s. So just trying to sort of set the stage for when when it was discovered, or we think it was discovered, to sort of our modern day understanding of it and how we came to better understand what it does and chemical composition and all that good stuff.
You alluded to this at the end of the history lesson, sort of, but I think it's really important to point out that psilocybin itself is actually not a psychoactive compound. But when the body metabolizes psilocybin, when it's consumed, it strips off a phosphate molecule of psilocybin, and it's converted into its metabolite, which is called psilocin. And psilocin is highly psychoactive. So that's sort of when we're talking about psilocybin, it's really that psilocin molecule that is what creates the psychoactive effects in humans, at least.
People, and this is going to be a very stupid question. I know you're going to educate us in a sec, but it sounds like you could isolate the psilocin, and is that like, do people take that and then just trip or like, is that something that people do?
Well, actually, so how it works is psilocybin is actually considered what's called a prodrug, which is just a substance that's considered inactive until it's ultimately converted into its active form following administration. So I think throughout the episode, we're sort of going to use psilocybin and psilocin interchangeably, but I think it's important for folks to know that it really is it's that psilocin molecule that's responsible for the psychoactive effects. But psilocybin is what's most commonly found in nature.
All right, Dr. Scheinman, can you tell us more, and then also how it's used and how it, how our bodies process it?
Yeah, absolutely. So once ingested, you're eating a mushroom. So once it's ingested, gets into your system, it takes about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how much you consume and the contents of your stomach, for it to be absorbed by the mucosal lining of the gut and into the bloodstream, where it's, like I said, then it's converted into psilocin. And eventually this psilocin, because psilocin is a lot smaller of a molecule than psilocybin, and so it can much more easily pass through the blood-brain barrier and enter into the brain. And just as a reminder for folks, the brain is encased in sort of this like dynamic barrier that's called the blood-brain barrier. It's a sort of, you can think of it as like this blood, a vessel, capillary covered, like mesh covering of your brain. And it protects the brain and really only allows like certain substances in that are safe and then keeps other substances out. So psilocin can very easily pass this blood-brain barrier and then enter into the brain. So once it enters into the brain, like this is when people usually start to experience what the recreational drug community typically calls the trip. So this is when you start the trip or tripping, and this primarily occurs through the binding of psilocin to serotonin receptors. So psilocin is a molecule that very, very closely mimics serotonin. So it's what's referred to in science as an agonist. So it's like, you can think of it as like fake serotonin. It very easily fits into like the same receptor puzzle pieces as serotonin fits into. And serotonin, just as a reminder to folks, is what's called a neurotransmitter, and it's responsible for regulating mood, appetite, and sleep, and as well as like general awareness. So psilocin, we can think of it as a serotonin receptor agonist, and it mimics the actions of serotonin by activating a specific type of serotonin receptor called 5-HT2A. So serotonin is a very, very ubiquitous neurotransmitter in the brain. It's very, very common. And because it's responsible for so many different effects, there are different types of receptors that it can activate when it's trying to do different things that it does. So psilocin doesn't activate every single serotonin receptor. It only activates that 5-HT2A receptor. But to a lesser extent, psilocin also interacts with some of the other serotonin receptors as well, in addition to some dopamine receptors, histamine receptors, and adrenergic receptor subtypes. So that was a lot of information, but that's basically just in a nutshell like how psilocybin is actually working.
Oh, I love that you're a neuroscientist and you're really getting into that. And I want to hear more. And I'll give the disclaimer. So I've never done shrooms, so I don't even know like what you're describing. I've never taken a psychedelic or a hallucinogen or anything like that. So, okay. So walk me through this. So it's an actual mushroom and you eat part of it, all of it, multiple mushrooms. I guess it depends if you're microdosing or not, right?
So I guess let's talk about microdosing a little bit, because it is something that sort of comes up a lot, and like I imagine it's on social media a lot. I think there are some like eccentric billionaires and like very successful people that sort of like very creative people, like artists that sort of like live and die by microdosing. You hear this.
Yeah, they're like, open your brain with microdosing. Yes.
Right. You're hearing about this a lot. So as with any drug or compound or substance, like you can take, there's a spectrum of dosing when it comes to psilocybin. So microdosing, as the name implies, is like a very small amount of the substance. And what's tricky about psilocybin is because it's in a mushroom form, it's very difficult to determine the amount of psilocybin that's actually present in each piece of mushroom. And that can vary by mushroom species. I think that I'm not sure exactly how this works in therapeutic settings, but I imagine it's a little bit more, easier for them. They have some sort of a way of controlling for the dosage. But when most people take a psilocybin recreationally, like when they're microdosing, they're just going to take like a much smaller amount of the drug itself. And that's just kind of what people are talking about when they say microdosing. It's just like
I'm curious, and maybe we'll get into this in a sec, but people make a lot of big claims about microdosing, and I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Are there actually any impacts? And certainly this is not a go out and do shrooms episode. I just want to give that disclaimer. Yeah.
No, that's a good disclaimer. Like, right. I mean, obviously, like here at Unbiased, we're not in the business of telling you what to do or what not to do. Like, that's not the point of this. We're just kind of talking to you about what the evidence is showing.
Right.
But I will sort of say that at the federal level, psilocybin and hallucinogenic drugs in general are still classified as Schedule I substances. So they are illegal in most states.
And for, I don't know, some context, I'm 99% sure heroin is a class 1 drug as well. And just to show you sort of how it's classified by the DEA and all that good stuff. Okay, so you're taking the mushroom, you're eating it, and then what, after like 15 minutes or something, it gets absorbed into your bloodstream and that's when the effects start?
More like 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay.
Because if you're eating it, so it has to be metabolized and travel through the digestive system, enter into the bloodstream, and then get into the brain, where it then binds to those 5-HT2A serotonin receptors that I mentioned. But I think so now I think might be a good time to dive into how psilocybin actually affects the brain.
Please.
Okay, so. Sorry, guys, you're on with a neuroscientist, so I get really jazzed about this stuff. I took an entire class on drugs in college too, so I had a bit of a fascination with this stuff, and I still do. I mean, it's very, very interesting stuff. So psilocybin affects a bunch of different brain regions, and I'm just going to go through a few of them. So the first one is what's called the prefrontal cortex, and this is a part of the brain that's involved in decision making, personality expression, and the modulation of social behavior. And psilocybin's interaction with this brain region can lead to altered judgment and behavior, as well as like altered willingness to express certain thoughts and emotions and the lowering of inhibitions. This can also lead to enhanced introspection, which is what a lot of users will report. So typically when they talk about like expanding the mind, this is maybe referring to the activation of those 5-HT2A serotonin receptors in the prefrontal cortex. So then we've got the visual cortex, and the visual cortex is located in the occipital lobe of the brain, which is the back of the head. And psilocybin leads to enhanced visual perception, which can create the perception of visual stimuli that aren't actually present in the external environment. So these are what are often known as hallucinations. So a lot of people will experience visual hallucinations when they take psilocybin or other hallucinogenic drugs. So visual hallucinations can involve like intricate and often like kaleidoscopic visuals. And users often report that they see intensified colors and like intricate patterns and even like heightened visual clarity. So that's sort of when, you think of sort of like the colors and the wavy lines and the aesthetics that are often associated with psychedelic usage. Like this is really where it's coming from, is the activation of the visual cortex. And then finally, like we have the amygdala and hippocampus, which are also potentially impacted by psilocybin. And these are regions that are responsible for memory and emotional processing. And these two regions, the interaction of these two regions, they play key roles in how we process and store highly emotional memories, including certain traumas. So psilocybin can therefore sometimes lead to like enhanced emotional sensitivity and the ability to potentially like revisit and reprocess unpleasant memories and emotions in a new light. And I think this is really where the idea of using psilocybin in a therapeutic context for different different mood conditions in general is sort of where that comes from.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's almost like it's not exposure therapy. I'm trying to think of like what the term is, but if you're saying it's like opening you up to, like, could it open your brain I'm using air quotes and you're not watching, to like repress trauma and experiences. That's sort of what you're.
I mean, well, one of the things that psilocybin is being looked into for a therapeutic for is as post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think that this is sort of where it comes from, is that psilocybin can lead to the revisiting and reprocessing of like those traumatic experiences. And like that's how it might be helpful for people with PTSD.
But I could also see that being, or what do you know, when you say a bad trip, like that could also not be such a great beneficial experience, right?
Exactly right. And I think you're hitting the nail on the head for why psilocybin is only legal in, I believe it's 2 states right now, Oregon and Colorado.
I think it's 3, but I'll double check on that.
2 or 3 states. And the reason for this is because all of the things that I've spoken about so far they're very subjective experiences, and just mentioned the bad trip, quote unquote. What's tricky about these types of substances is that it's really hard to determine whether the responses will be positive or whether they can potentially be negative. That's how I like to think of these types of drugs, as sort of like a hard reset of the brain. So like turning it on and turning it off again. And what psilocybin, another thing that psilocybin does is it strengthens connections between brain networks that aren't even necessarily strongly connected before taking of the drug. So brain regions that don't normally communicate with each other, like, will start talking to each other. And brain areas that are usually highly active sometimes become less active. And I just want to mention one of those that's called the default mode network. And the default mode network is a network of brain regions that's typically associated with self-referential thinking and what's called the ego. And this network will sort of quiet down a little bit. And that's where people will sometimes report what's called the ego death, where they are or like the ego, the dissolving of the ego, or like mind expanding. And that's, like I said, sort of hitting the reset button on your brain, and the usual patterns of thought and perception sort of get shifted. And this can sometimes be for the positive and can help with the processing of traumatic experiences and dysfunctional patterns of thought, but it can really also sometimes be really, really detrimental and sometimes produce even more trauma.
Okay, I feel like I would be a disaster on shrooms. I'm just going to say that right now. Like I am an anxious, like with my anxiety and depression and all this stuff that I just push down. I feel like it would be a bad trip. But so you put something really interesting in our outline, and I want to ask you about it. You said, wait, did you just say this ego dissolving? Like that phrase really got to me. Like that's a wild, very impactful statement right there.
Yeah. And so going back to microdosing for a second, this reporting of ego dissolving and like, so it's also called ego death, which is, I think that's a little much, but it's a little bit too intense of a term, I think. But what we're talking about when with microdosing, usually people will report at the lower doses of psilocybin more of the activation of the visual cortex. So like visual hallucinations, the enhancement of color perception, and then sort of less of that activation of the amygdala and hippocampus, and the quieting of the default mode network. That usually happens at higher doses. So when people talk about microdosing, usually they're talking about just like more of the visual perceptional shift as opposed to like more of an internal self-referential shift.
Okay. Well, alrighty. That put the nail.
And again, this is all very subjective, and it is based on user report. So it's very difficult to sort of measure. It's very difficult to measure perception, right? Like that's one of the really big challenges in cognitive neuroscience today. Like we don't know how to determine like what I'm seeing is different than like what Jess is seeing.
Right. It's a quantification nightmare for a data scientist because exactly for what you're saying.
Exactly. So like that's what's tricky about something like quantifying the like what people will perceive when they're on hallucinogenic drugs. And there's also difference too, because when one person takes psilocybin on one day will be different from their response if they take it, like the following month or the following year. Because just one more thing, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but one more thing that's really important that people consider when they're talking about psilocybin usage in a therapeutic context is set and setting. So set refers to like your mindset when you're going into the psychedelic experience. And then setting is also like where you are physically located. So these two things are very, very important and will play into the shift in perceptual change when you do experience the trip.
All right. I think if we could move into sort of legal status and policies, that would be interesting for folks.
Oh, yeah. Let's definitely talk about that.
So, okay, you said Colorado and it's so funny. I say Oregon coming from New York. We all say Oregon, but I know it's Oregon.
Oregon.
Okay, so I think Oregon was the first. Let me just hang on. There's an interesting website called TripSitter that sort of maps this, and so we'll link to that. But yeah,
of course there is.
So it's, I want to be clear, this is not for, it's not legal for recreational use anywhere, but it is legal for therapeutic use in certain places. So, so for example, magic mushrooms were decriminalized in Colorado in November of 2022. If you want, I could jump down to Oregon. I believe Washington, D.C. just recently moved towards that as well. Which was a big shift. And then some municipalities within states. So here, wait, let me just see this. This is interesting. So in November 2020, that's when Oregon became the first U.S. state to decriminalize psilocybin and legalize it for therapeutic use. So Oregon really paved the way, then Colorado. And then, if you visit this site, like I'll go to Massachusetts since that's where I live. It says, here we go, I'm so sorry. Here we go. Okay. Magic mushrooms are decriminalized in 4 municipalities here. So again, not state level, but in Cambridge, Northampton, which is only 30 minutes from me, Somerville, and East Hampton. In those places, specifically, it's decriminalized. And then interestingly, like some of the, so Massachusetts still lists, they list psilocybin as a Class C substance. So that's along with other substances like THC. However, mushrooms are still illegal, and their possession, sale, or cultivation is punishable by high fines and even imprisonment. So lots of variation by state and by municipality. Okay. Other things that I thought were interesting that I wanted to mention here. So I did tons of reading. So yes, the increasing prevalence of psilocybin use, particularly in the form of microdosing, raises a lot of questions for policymakers. And more we see U.S. state and local officials easing regulations. And then federal policymakers, it's sort of interesting to see the interplay between state and federal, because they're facing questions regarding appropriate policy frameworks and then potential alternatives to prohibition. So at the federal level, as you said, psilocybin is a Schedule 1 substance under the Controlled Substances Act, meaning it has, quote, a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use in treatment, again, at the federal level, and a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. All right. There was a really, really interesting report put out by Johns Hopkins. We'll link to this. This was in 2018. And researchers actually recommended that psilocybin be reclassified from Schedule 1 to Schedule 4 if it passes phase 3 clinical trials. Schedule 4 is the category used for things like prescription sleep aids, although researchers did suggest maintaining stricter controls. So just to distill some of the key points for their analysis, and we'll get into what the research shows a little bit more in a sec. Studies show psilocybin has low abuse potential in both animals and humans. It is one of the lowest harm profiles among both legal and illegal substances. No known lethal overdose level has been established, and early research suggests potential benefits for things like smoking cessation and cancer-related depression and anxiety. They did emphasize that even with reclassification, psilocybin should only be administered in controlled healthcare settings by trained professionals, similar to how anesthesia is managed, rather than being prescribed for home use. I thought that was interesting. Okay. Well, can I ramble a little bit more, or do you? Okay, so just a few things. So political trends, early legislation was primarily in liberal-leaning states. More conservative states have begun proposing legislation starting in 2022, suggesting growing bipartisan support. Based on cannabis legalization patterns, researchers project that most states will legalize psychedelics between 2033 and 2037. That's the prediction. Some of the key concerns that have been identified: lack of mechanisms to verify drug content and quality outside of medical settings, limited requirements for provider training and licensing, undeveloped clinical and billing infrastructure, no consensus on contraindications or drug interactions, and lack of guidance for special populations like elderly, children, and those who are pregnant. So the last thing, interestingly, so Johns Hopkins, they note that rapid legislative movement is unusual for pharmaceutical substances, which typically go through FDA approval processes first. And they really emphasize the need for more comprehensive regulatory frameworks to ensure safe and effective implementation.
What's interesting to note too is that, like, and why it's confusing that this is classified as a Schedule 1 substance along with, heroin and some of the like scarier drugs is because there really is, and you did mention this, that there's really no way to sort of overdose on this type of thing. I mean, it has no abuse potential in that. And when we're talking about abuse, we're talking about like addiction in the clinical sense of the word, right? So it's very, very rare. I think it's not necessarily even really been heard of that people will develop a really physical dependency on this stuff.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Were you going to say something else?
Well, no, and I mean, and then but be that as it may, it still means that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's quote unquote safe, because we do still have a lack of mechanistic understanding to verify like what exactly will be the outcomes when people take any dose of this substance.
Right. So, okay, now let's move, if we can, toward therapeutic potential and looking at some of the research. I read a bunch of papers. The main outcomes that I saw, I'd say the best evidence for, depression and anxiety, addiction, and PTSD. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But other applications being explored, I mean, I just said it, mental health applications, veterans and PTSD treatment, which you mentioned, used to treat treatment-resistant depression, which occurs in approximately 10% of people with depression, and then things like addiction and smoking cessation. All right. So here's a just very high level overview of some of the research I read. So psilocybin has demonstrated significant antidepressant effects, especially in, as we just said, treatment resistant depression. Studies show that 1 or 2 doses can improve symptoms for up to 6 months. It also shows potential in reducing anxiety, particularly in patients with cancer-related psychiatric distress. Then for addiction, preliminary studies suggest psilocybin may help reduce dependence on substances like tobacco and alcohol, although more research is definitely needed to confirm these findings. And then for PTSD, and I'm curious, I don't really know what this means, but psilocybin's psychoplastogenic effects, which promote neural plasticity, suggests that it could be effective in treating PTSD symptoms, although this area requires further exploration. What does that mean?
Psychoplastogenic. Okay, so what we're talking about when we say psychoplastogenic is just and I sort of alluded to this earlier, is the creation of new connections between at the sort of more micro level different brain cells, so the different neurons, but also the creation of connections between new brain networks. So just, I use the analogy of sort of like a hard reboot. That's kind of what this has been theorized to produce, is the creation of just new connections. And that's what we mean by neuroplasticity. So plasticity just means the creation or strengthening of existing connections or the creation of new connections between cells in the brain.
Got it. Thank you for explaining that, because I think a lot of what I see on social media microdosing, they use this word neuroplasticity a lot. So interesting. All right.
And also like, and this can be, neuroplasticity is also the mechanism that is known to be the cellular underpinning of learning.
Interesting.
So when we learn new things, synaptic plasticity is at play.
All right. Now, if I could just summarize some of the research I came across on safety and risks. So for safety, psilocybin is generally well tolerated with few serious adverse effects when administered in controlled settings with psychotherapeutic support. However, some studies report mild and transient side effects and rare instances of increased suicidal ideation. In terms of efficacy, the compound shows a positive benefit-risk balance with immediate and prolonged effects after 1 to 3 doses. However, larger, well-designed trials are necessary to establish its efficacy conclusively. Paranoia and anxiety while tripping can put some people at risk of physical harm and sometimes even more long-term psychological problems. Effects can be unpredictable. Researchers emphasize the importance of what they call set and setting, so mindset and environment in which psilocybin is consumed. And then in therapeutic settings, trained professionals guide patients through the experience to ensure safety and maximize therapeutic benefits. And then the last thing is repeated administration leads to rapid tolerance of the drug effects, likely due to 5-HT2A receptor downregulation, but the drug is not thought to be addictive in the traditional sense.
All of these things are reasons why I think there's been some pushback on legalization. Is that I think just the one thing that scientists in particular are concerned about is that the effects can be unpredictable. So while psilocybin can create all of these new connections between brain networks, and then this can be sort of a positive experience emotionally, it can also be really dangerous for some people, especially folks that suffer from conditions that are like, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, where there's a bit of a shakier grounding in reality. That these types of drugs, hallucinogenics and psilocybin in particular, can be really dangerous and detrimental for people like that suffer from those particular ailments.
So my takeaway from all of this is that there is some compelling, interesting research of potential therapeutic benefits, although everything I've seen really stresses, again, set and setting, right? Like where you're doing this in a controlled environment. But it's like a burgeoning field of research where I think we still need more large, well-designed trials to really understand it.
Absolutely. And since psilocybin is still illegal at the federal level and it's classified as a Schedule I drug, it's extremely difficult for researchers to study it because it requires so much. It just requires a lot of like a lot of administrative oversight. It takes a lot for a study to be like even greenlit.
It's an IRB nightmare. And if you know, you know, right? Institutional Review Board nightmare, like writing the research protocol for this. And because in those, protocols that you design, you have to really demonstrate protection of human subjects and safety. And with, I think, so many of the unknowns of this, as you said, it's probably really difficult to get the green light. So,
so like while people are saying that like this might have some potential therapeutically, but we need more research,
right,
then it's really hard to get more research done. So it's sort of this cycle,
right? Which is a good thing. I mean, I want to say like the IRB and human protections. That's fantastic that we have that because in the past when we didn't have that, terrible things happened. But yes, it makes this specific type of research challenging. All right. Well, I learned a lot. Do you have any last thoughts, Sarah? You want to take us home?
I mean, absolutely. Like we said, the purpose of this episode wasn't to like promote the use of psychedelics or to take any sort of a stance on whether or not it should be legalized. Like we're just here to tell you like this is the state of things. It's very, very fascinating stuff from the neurobiological level, and I really think that we're going to learn more in the coming years about its treatment potential and also, what exactly it's doing to the brain. And on that note, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. We hope you learned a thing or two. Please join us next week on your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.